All right, let's keep going here. Not a whole lot to kind of start out with today before we jump into material. After class today, the next quiz will pop up. So week 3, kind of covering this week's material. I'll make a comment at the end. I have a sneaking suspicion we won't quite get through surpluses and shortages, so there shouldn't be. We don't get through it, there won't be a question on the quiz about that. But we'll see kind of how far we get. So I'll make sure I mention that at the end of class. Pack assignment, kind of have mentioned, it's not due until the end of next week, but get on, it's the first one, make sure, if I can find it, we get registered, kind of start working on that early, get that out of the way, get those easy points, okay? So you'll have that module quiz pop up after class. You'll also have, what else? Module 4 reading, all right? Both due at the end of the day, Monday. This class, things move fast in the semester. So we've got this week, we got next week, and then the next week is first exam, right? So we're moving quick. That first exam will be the first 4 modules. We've got through module 3 this week. Module 4 we'll go through next week. We'll have a class period of review and then the exam. And obviously I'll talk more about the exam next week, but it's kind of giving us a roadmap of where we're going, okay? CL sessions will be kind of like they were last week. So Thursday, Sunday nights. I put up an announcement. There is one of the locations Sunday the leader had to cancel. Where is it at? Here we go. So I think it's, 243 on Sunday will not be available, but all the other locations should be. There's more than enough slots, like I said, based off of the attendance from last week. I also put some information up about those additional, I don't know, they call them like tutoring sessions, but really it's like a 3-hour open time block where there's graduate students over in Wiley Hall on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday evenings from 6 to 9. You can always go there and ask questions. It's not like the CL sessions in that they don't have any of my materials specifically, right? So they don't have anything that they're like set to work through. But if you have specific questions that you bring to them, they'll kind of help you work through those. Okay. So just trying to make you aware of multiple resources to kind of help you as I get questions. I didn't do so well on the quiz. What do I do? This is another good kind of resource to use. Okay. Any other questions before we jump in here to material today? Okay. All right. So we didn't quite talk about taxes and subsidies last class. I'll introduce the idea of subsidies later on today for consumers. We won't worry about taxes on consumers for right now. We'll kind of save that for later off in the semester. So if you want to kind of ignore taxes on consumers, I won't ask you anything about that. We will talk about subsidies and how that shifts our demand curve. Once again, I'll give you some examples later on so we see exactly how that works. Here's a summary of all the things that we talked about last class that shift, either increase or decrease demand. So I'm going to go through a little bit quicker the flip side of things because a lot of the same principles apply. But today we're going to start with supply and then kind of mash the two together, right? So supply, right? Just like we had a relationship between price and quantity demand, we said that as the price goes up, consumers are going to, the quantity demanded or how much they want to buy is going to do what? Prices are higher, you're buying something, do you want to buy more or less? Less, right? So we have this inverse relationship that existed between price and quantity demanded. If I'm selling something and the price is higher, is that a good or a bad thing? So am I going to want to sell more? Yes. Yes, right? So unlike demand, the law of supply says that as the price goes up, the quantity supplied will also go up. So what is this going to look like? Well, just like we had a demand schedule, we've got a supply schedule, right? At all these various prices, here's the quantity supplied. Right? So as that price goes up, right? If the price is 0, I don't want to supply anything to the market, right? As that price increases, I'm going to want to supply higher and higher amounts. Okay? So we can think about why here in a second, but for right now, I think that seems fairly intuitive. Just like with demand, if I have a supply schedule, what could I do? I could create a graphical representation. Here's my y-axis values, price, just like with demand. Instead of quantity demanded, we now have quantity supplied. We'll put that on our x-axis. Now it's just a matter of plotting each one of these points, right? 0, 0, 3, 1, 6, 2, 9, 3, so on and so forth. And that supply schedule would tell us essentially what our supply curve looks like. Now, in this class, I said I'm always going to keep it linear, so we have these nice linear supply curves. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Like I said, I'll go through this stuff a little bit quicker because it's pretty similar to what we talked about last week, just different stuff. If I wanted to use an equation to represent this, what would the intercept of this supply equation be? 0, right? At what price is that quantity supplied equal to 0? Well, here it happens to also be 0. Now, what's the slope of this supply curve? Right? So if I'm looking at any 2 points on this curve, how would I find the slope of a line? The change in y over the change in x. What's my y-axis? Price. What's my x-axis? Quantity supplied. How much is y going up by between each one of these points? 1 divided by how much is quantity supplied going up every time price goes up by $1. So my slope would be 1/3. Right? Now, notice with supply, right? So we had our intercept in our example. That would be kind of our A, right? It's not y equals mx plus b equal, and that's like a very mathematical way. I just going to use A and B here to represent the intercept and slope. What's true about my slope for the supply curve? It's always going to be positive, right? This captures that relationship between price and quantity supplied. Unlike demand, we said demand will always have a negative slope, capturing that inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay? So very similar things to what we were doing last class, just thinking about it now from the producer or the supplier, the seller of a good. So this was a little bit hard to think about sometimes because most of us are consumers in 99% of our everyday life. But if you were to sell something, right, maybe you're selling a used car, maybe you have some experience doing that. Maybe you have a side hustle where you're selling, I don't know, my brother does like these huge not baseball specifically, but these huge card shows, right? So in some context, if you think about you've ever been a seller of a good, that's the mindset you want to put yourself in. Okay. So let's think about what the supply curve is telling us. So if I've got my quantity supplied here, my price, here's my supply curve. Okay. If I'm willing to supply, say, that very first unit when the price is $4, okay? So let's think about what that really means. That means if that's the first price I'd be willing to supply it at, if the price was $3 for the supplier, what is the price? When we're talking about marginal benefits and marginal costs, when I'm selling something, the price would be my what? So if you sell something for $3, is that a benefit or a cost to you? Are you receiving money when you sell it? Yes, that is a benefit to you, right? Someone's giving you money, that's a benefit, right? You're receiving some value. So here we can kind of think about the price is reflecting the marginal benefit to the supplier. So it would have to mean that if the marginal benefit is 3 and I'm not yet willing to supply that to the market, I said the first price at which I would supply that to the market is 4. What must that mean? If I don't sell it, it means the marginal benefit must be less than the marginal cost, right? Right? We only do something if the marginal benefit is what? Greater than or equal to. So the marginal benefit was the price to suppliers. So as long as that price is below their marginal cost, they won't sell that first unit. As soon as that price hits $4, we said that's where they'll first supply it. So what must be true is that's the point where marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost, or where the price is equal to. So what does the supply curve tell us? We said the demand curve tells us the marginal benefit to consumers. The supply curve tells us the marginal cost to producers. So we know that because these are the first prices at which they would supply it to the market, these must be the first prices or the first marginal benefits that are high enough that are exactly equal to that marginal cost, making the supplier essentially indifferent. Right? Now, if the price goes even higher, well, then for sure I'm going to sell that first unit because now the marginal benefit is even higher than. Let's say the price was 5. Well, for sure I'm going to supply that first unit. Right? The marginal benefit is now way higher than the marginal cost. So demand curves represent marginal benefits. of the consumers. Supply curves represent the marginal cost to producers or suppliers, okay? Or sellers. All these are kind of interchangeable terms, okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So I've got this in the slides, but since we have this visual, so what's happening to the marginal cost as I supply more and more to the market? Well, remember, we said as I do more of something, even when we think about our production possibilities curve, what was happening as we produced more of something? The slope was getting steeper, which meant my opportunity cost was going up, being higher, right? Steeper slope, larger value. So as I produce more of something, what should be happening to my marginal costs? Well, for the first unit, they're relatively low. For the second unit, a little bit higher. Third, a little bit higher. My marginal costs are increasing. It's the same thing we were talking about last module. So I'll try to make these connections as we move from kind of topic to topic, but it's the same thing we were talking about last week. As I supply more of something, as I produce more of something, those marginal costs are increasing. Applies to an economy, applies to a firm as well. Okay. So, you know, if we go back here, if that supply curve tells me my marginal costs, what was the marginal cost of the second, third, and night Starbucks drink here? Well, I would just go to what was the second unit supplied. So that would be at a, what, in between kind of 0 and 3. So I could kind of back out my equation. If I wanted to know the marginal cost of that second unit, just like we said, the price essentially reflects the marginal benefit to consumers, our supply curve, that price reflects the marginal cost. So if I want the marginal cost of the second unit, just plug it 2 in. So that'd be what, 2/3? What if I wanted the marginal cost of the seventh unit? Just plug 7 in there, 7/3 or what? 2 1/3, right? So another way of thinking about this price equation is that price is really just telling you the marginal costs of different quantities. And you just plug in those quantities, then kind of come up with what those marginal costs are. Okay. So we kind of did that last class with that marginal benefit and demand. So it's just kind of the flip side of it. So, you know, you could plug in 2, 3, 9, come up with what those marginal cost values are. Any questions before we start to kind of move to things that shift supply? So once again, I'll go through these a little bit quicker since we kind of already have a basis for this with what we talked about with demand. But how did we get market demand? I took every individual demand curve and I added them up, right? So how am I going to find market supply? I'm going to take every firm's supply curve and I'm going to add them up at every single price, right? So let's say I had 2 individuals, right? Starbucks and Jitterbug here. Here's the amount they would supply at all these various prices. To get market supply, all I'm going to do is at every single price, well, Starbucks is going to supply 3 drinks at $1. Jitterbug is supplying 2. The total market supply would be 5 at that price of $1. At a price of $6, each firm is producing what, 18 and 12. So my total market supply is 30. I don't think I'm in breaking news here, right? So if this is how I come up with market supply, right? So I'm just taking these values. Now I'm plotting market supply. Right? What happens, and I'll skip through this for a second to get somewhere. So I'm jumping the gun. There we go. If I'm thinking about if I have more sellers of a product, right? What's going to happen to my supply curve? Well, if I'm getting my market supply by adding up every individual supply curve, if I have more individuals supplying that good, I have more suppliers. What's going to happen to my market supply? It's going to be, I mean, like, I know it's early, but I mean, if I have 2 people and I add together what they're producing, if I add a third, at the very worst, if that third person is producing nothing, it stays the same. If that third person is in the market producing anything, my new market supply has to be higher, right? So I'm adding another person to it. I'm adding another value. So when we're thinking about the number of suppliers, right? And we'll talk about other things that shift supply that I skipped, right? Probably should reorder my slides here. Sometimes in the moment, the way I talk, I like to go in a slightly different order than I had planned. So if I'm thinking about my supply curve, right? What's going to happen if I have more suppliers? We said supply is going to increase. But what does that look like? Well, that means that at every single price, right? Whatever the quantity supplied was before, maybe I only had 2 firms. Once I add a third, is the quantity supply going to be higher or lower? So that would be at a point over here, right? Same price, but now I have a third seller. There's going to be more available on the market. If the price is up here, I add a third seller. The quantity supplied is going to be up here. So anytime I have a supply increase, this is why I said last class, even with demand, I don't use the terms upward and downward shifts. I use the terms what? Rightward and leftward. Why? Because with supply, increases in supply are rightward shifts. We're moving away, if it helps, we're moving away from this 0, 0 origin point. Right? Now, if I draw up and down arrows, which way would the arrow go? Down? I can confuse myself. This isn't a decrease in demand. It's just that visually that line is shifting downward. Right? But the actual mathematics behind this linear equation is that when it shifts to the right, that means that at every single price, quantity supplied is now increasing. So I wouldn't use up and down arrows. I would stick with this idea of increases in either supply or demand, rightward shifts. Decreases in either supply or demand would look like what? Well, that would mean at every single price, let's say I have fewer sellers, right? Maybe this is, I don't know. There's some fad and everybody's trying, well, over like COVID, that's when my brother got into selling all these collectible cards. And then all of a sudden, like people didn't have as much time. The market kind of plummeted. There's now way fewer people doing that. So at every single price, there would now be a, smaller number of sellers, or supply would kind of write this here would represent my supply decrease. And just to kind of make this easier, maybe here's my supply. If you don't have colors, here's my supply increase. Right? So supply increases are rightward shifts. Supply decreases are leftward shifts. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we start talking about other things that will shift this supply curve? Yeah.
When price being changed leads to it shifting right and left, but if it's price upward or down.
Yeah, so if you're thinking about this supply curve, last class we talked about the demand. The demand curve tells us a relationship. It's a visual representation of the price, the relationship between the price of that good now and the quantity demanded right now. Changes in anything else, that line, that relationship between the price and the quantity of the goods stays the same, but it's going to shift where that line is at. Supply is the same thing. The supply curve tells me the relationship between price and quantity supplied. That relationship hasn't changed. As the price goes up or down, people will sell more or less of it. However, if these other factors, like there's more suppliers changes, that will shift the entire curve. Yep. Try not to trip. Any other questions before we kind of go through some of the other things that would shift supply? Okay. Oh, we're doing great on time. So, not blank. I want to show you the slides again. There we go. So we kind of I went through this first example, the number of suppliers or sellers. I think that's the easiest thing to think about, increasing or decreasing supply. We'll go back. Whoops. Here I've got some kind of visuals in the slides. If you're not copying down what I'm doing in class. Once again, the slides are good, but sometimes I do things that, I mentioned in class that might make it easier. I wouldn't draw the arrows like this. How did I say I would draw the arrows? Left and right. I mean, these kind of are left and right, but just to be very, very clear, I would draw them the way I drew them up here. And that's going to help solidify this idea that increases are rightward shifts, decreases are leftward shifts. Okay. So if supply, we said, represents what to the producers? Demand represented marginal benefits. So supply represented the producers' marginal costs. So if I have increases in input prices, so let's say oh, I don't know, I'm producing the batteries that are in electric vehicles, and all of a sudden the price of lithium goes way up, which is needed to produce these batteries. If I'm a producer of these electric batteries, what's going to happen intuitively to my supply? If it costs me more to make these, am I going to want to supply more or less than I was before? Less. Why? Because even if the price stayed the same, that price was my what? Marginal. So be careful. When I'm selling something and I sell it for $5, that $5 to me is so the price of the good is so if all of a sudden my marginal cost to produce it go up, that price could stay the same. My marginal benefit of selling it stays the same, but it now costs me more to make it. I'm less likely to supply it to the market, right? Because if lithium batteries, the price of lithium all of a sudden goes up to, I don't even have any idea or reference point about what the price of lithium is. But if they increase enough to where I can't sell it for more than that, I'm not going to supply it to the market anymore, right? So, excuse me. So if we're thinking about if my input prices go up, right? And this could be anything, like I use lithium batteries, it makes sense to me. But this really, if all of a sudden well, I'll give you a good example. If I'm producing, this is good, something that we like primarily only import. So let's say like a lot of clothing, right? Manufacturing, it's all done overseas, right? A lot of it, we import it. Why? Because for domestic suppliers, what's one of their main input prices? If I'm any company, one of the things I need in order to produce anything is I have to pay my workers. So in the US, relative to other countries, what's true about the price of labor or how much workers are paid? Higher. So input prices, if I keep my production in the US, are going to be higher. It's going to cost me more to produce the same good. So what happens if the input price goes up? We see fewer people want to supply that good. Companies leave the US and instead do their manufacturing somewhere else. Right? So increases in input prices are going to decrease supply, right? There's going to be fewer people who want to supply this good. Said differently, if input prices all of a sudden plummet, right, we're going to see a lot of people say, well, that's an industry. It's very low cost to produce that good. If I enter that market, maybe I can make some money, right? Because if it's really, really low cost to produce this good, as long as the price is above that cost, I can sell something for, if you want to think about it for now, a profit, right? So decreases in input prices are going to increase the supply of certain goods. Okay? Any questions on this before we okay? So this is a really dumb example, kind of. But if I'm a company, let's say I'm selling breakfast items, right? And I'm making the choice between what I'm producing. Maybe I'm making like egg and bacon sandwiches, or I'm just making things like just bagels and cream cheese. The price of eggs goes way up. What am I going to want to supply less of? Those egg and bacon sandwiches, right? That's the idea of what we're doing. If input prices go up, we supply less. Input prices go down, I'm willing to supply more than I was before. Okay. Well, I've got some other examples here. This is the one I always like to use labor because, like, the minimum wage is always increasing. I don't know the last time that the federal government decreased the minimum wage. I don't know if they actually ever have. She's more of an economic historian on that. For the most part, right, cost of labor is always going up. So we're always going to see kind of fewer and fewer of these companies that require minimum wage workers, right? What sugar price, the input, the price of sugar goes up. We see fewer producers of candy, whatever these inputs are, you could think of an example that makes sense to you and then kind of latch onto that example. Okay. Any questions over? No, I don't think that one's too bad. So how do I want to think about this? So I don't like this slide. I'll show you one way of thinking about input prices that's a little bit different. Now, once again, when you're drawing the shifts, I would think of them as rightward and leftward shifts. But to give you a little bit more insight into what's happening with input prices. If I start out, here was my initial supply curve, and that represented marginal costs. If whatever I'm producing, right? So let's say this was my lithium battery example. If lithium batteries are now, or lithium is more expensive, so it's going to cost me more to produce these batteries. To produce the same amount, right? What's going to have to be true? At that same quantity, because lithium is more expensive, what's happened to my marginal cost? It's now higher. What if I want to produce out here at this quantity? Well, if lithium is more expensive, to produce that same quantity, it's going to cost me more money. So when input prices go up, or essentially when the marginal cost to producing increases, what does this actually look like? A leftward shift or a decrease in supply. So it gets kind of hard to think about with supply because yes, the marginal costs are increasing, but if marginal costs are increasing, it costs me more to produce something. That means I'm going to supply less of it. But we can kind of think about it on different axes and kind of get different intuition out of kind of what this shift is telling us. Okay, it's telling us that if we produce the same amount, it costs us more. If we sell it at the same price, we would sell fewer of that good. Kind of two different things we can get out of that shift. Okay. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. I will kind of go quickly through this one because it's really exactly what we just talked about. If I have improvements in technology, what's going to be happening to my input prices? Well, we actually even talked about it. When we had increases in technology with my production possibilities curve, what happened to the good that had a technology improvement? On that axis, it shifted out. So what did that do to our slope? Made it flatter, which meant the cost of producing that good went down, right? Or essentially, when we have improvements in technology, the cost of producing or the input prices essentially go down. Think about my stupid lithium battery example. If all of a sudden there's some new technology and they can use the same amount of lithium, but they found a way to make 10 batteries out of it instead of 5, each battery is now going to cost me a lower amount. I'm using the same lithium, but it's being spread across more units. So improvements in technology, if you want to write like next to this, it's the exact same thing as what we just did, which was improvements in technology would actually decrease my input prices. If input prices is now cheaper to make something, what happens to supply? Increases, right? Does that make any sense there why I'm going through this kind of quick? It's just different ways of saying the same thing, really, right? Improvements in technology mean that it costs me less to make each good than it did before, right? It's lowering my input prices. So we love technology, right? Because it's always lowering our costs. It's always going to lead to increases in supply. By the end of class, we'll think about what that increase in supply does to the what we call equilibrium price. Okay. We talked about the number of sellers already. We'll do expectations, right? So this kind of works the exact opposite of what we had with demand. Okay. So I've got the slides as kind of summaries. Sometimes I like to work through this and build it. So let's say that not consumers, but the sellers of goods expect the prices to be higher tomorrow, right? So if I think the price is going to be higher tomorrow and I'm selling something, what do I want to try to do? Today, I want to not sell it so that I can sell it when the price is higher, right? I might kind of stockpile this good. So if I think the prices are higher tomorrow, I expect prices to be higher in the future, what's going to happen to my current supply? If I think prices are going to be higher tomorrow, do I want to sell it today or tomorrow? So today, the supply will decrease, right? If I think that prices are going to be lower tomorrow, what do I want to make sure I do today? Guys, if you go through life and you can't figure this out, if you think the price is going to be lower tomorrow and you're selling something, do you want to sell it tomorrow or today? today. So what's going to happen to your current supply? It's going to increase. You're going to try to sell it today, right? Why would you hold on to it and sell it for a lower amount of money tomorrow, right? This doesn't make sense, right? So anytime we have price expectations, these actually work the exact opposite with consumers. Because for the consumer, the price is a bad thing. It's how much it costs me to buy this. When I'm selling a product, price expectations, the price that I'm selling it for is a good thing, right? I want to sell it when the price is high. If it helps you, you're all in the school of business. Dear God, if you just think about like the stock market, right? If you think the price of a stock is going to be lower tomorrow, you want to sell it today or no? Today, yeah. You think about it that way, right? So if the price is going to decrease tomorrow, the current supply is going to increase, right? Because everybody's going to want to, the price hasn't changed yet. So I'm going to want to unload this product before the price falls. Yeah. So, and the price is going to be lower tomorrow. Am I going to want to sell it today or tomorrow? Today. So the current supply, more people are going to want to supply it or sell it today. Yep. Yeah. So everything we're talking about now, it's not the buyer's perspective here, right? It's through the seller of the product. Yep. Question? Okay. All right. Good with this? Okay. I probably won't use as many examples. I think I've got market expectations in there. Kind of a good example though, where you could think about that there are other expectations that matter. For example, if I think it's going to be, you know, a particularly cold winter, I might want to try to stockpile. Did I do natural gas here? Yeah. I might want to try to stockpile natural gas because I know that people are going to need to use more gas in winter to heat their homes. And so if I think the price is going to be higher because of a cold winter, I might currently decrease my supply, hold on to that natural gas until I know the price is going to be higher. So really these market expectations, it's going to be different for every good, and it's still tied with prices, right? It's things in that market specifically where I think it might influence the price. So if I think it's going to be a colder than average winter, I think that means the price in the winter of natural gas would be higher. And then it has the same kind of effects that we were just talking about with price expectations. I likely won't use a lot of these in examples because, like I said, every good, it's going to be a little bit different, right? But ultimately, these market expectations work through our price expectations. So these are what you should really focus on, knowing kind of what the relationship is with shifting our supply curve, okay? All right, any more questions on this? We got one more thing that we're going to have shift supply here. Well, technically two, but one of them we kind of already talked about. Okay. So these get kind of weird, and I'll try to give you the best examples or examples that make sense to me. But we had substitutes and complements in consumption we talked about last class. We have the same thing, but for production. So if I have a production facility and I can produce two goods, right? The price of one of those goods goes up. So I have two goods, X and Y. The price of Y goes up. Am I going to be more or less likely to sell Y now? If I'm selling these goods, I want to sell the good that has a higher. So if the price of Y goes up, I want to supply more of, which means inherently, I'm going to have to give up producing some of. So if the price of the Y good goes up, I'm going to supply less of the other good, right? And then kind of the reverse, if all of a sudden the price of Y goes down, I no longer want to sell Y, I want to take my resources and produce more of X. I use a dumb example. I don't think it's dumb. It's actually pretty applicable to Indiana. So you might be like, well, what's a substitute in production? Like most production facilities are set up to only be able to make one thing. That's also not very true. Like anything that has a plastic mold, there's like these huge CNC machines. In fact, my father-in-law works for GM, and like every single car, like every door, everything like that, it's all made in the same machine, right? So they can but they can only use the machine to, you know, make one specific type of car door, whatever make and model of car it is. So they have a production facility where they can make a bunch of different products. They can make trucks, they can make SUVs, they can make cars, different makes and models, right? So it's not a stretch. The one that really makes sense to me, driving around every day, is if I have an empty field in Indiana, I can plant either corn or soybeans, right? And I am the producer, I'm the farmer, I can plant one of these crops this year. If I think the price of corn is going to be a lot higher this year. As a farmer, what do I want to plant in my field? Corn or soybeans? The price of corn is going to be higher. I want to plant corn, which means I'm not planting soybeans. So what happens to the supply of soybeans when the price of corn is high? Supply fewer soybeans. You see fewer farmers want to produce this good. Okay. So I always kind of, I don't know, I like that example because it's very real and I see it every day driving around, right, in Indiana. But like I said, any production facility that's set up to be able to make multiple types of goods, like a clothing manufacturer, right? They can make different types of clothing products, right? The ones that have higher prices, they're going to be they're going to want to be more likely to produce those that have the higher price, less likely to produce those that have the lower price. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So it kind of works the opposite of consumption here. Okay? Now, complementary goods, it works the exact opposite. It gets kind of goofy. I'll try to come up with some examples of this. I think the one I have here, I went to, so there's this distillery, you know, once you're old enough, you can go there. But it's called Hotel Tango. It's in Indianapolis, and they make whiskey and they've got some other drinks they make. And I didn't really realize this, but during the pandemic, what a lot of these distilleries did, through the process of making a lot of different liquors, one of the byproducts that you just get is like pure alcohol. Like I don't know the whole process. I'm not a chemist or whatever, but like essentially you get a byproduct in the creation of this liquor. And this byproduct is pure alcohol, which can be used to make hand sanitizer. That's basically what hand sanitizer is, 99.9% alcohol, right? So this would be a complement in production. If I want to produce more liquor, inherently through that production process, I'm getting more of this pure alcohol that can be used to make hand sanitizer. So I'm really getting two products at the same time, right? So during the pandemic, when people were all of a sudden wanting way more hand sanitizer, what do you think happened to the price of hand sanitizer? Went up. So if the price of hand sanitizer, the other good I'm getting in producing liquor, goes up, am I going to want to produce more or less liquor? Well, if I'm producing liquor, I'm getting more hand sanitizer, and I can now sell hand sanitizer for more money. I'm going to want to produce more liquor. Okay. Other complements in production, I don't like them as much, but just because you can't, I mean, how much can you really sell it for? But I always think about like, if I'm planing, you know, a log and I'm getting 2x4s like lumber, what inherently am I going to get out of that process? Very fine sawdust. By producing these boards, 2x4s, I'm inherently going to get this other good, which is sawdust, which you can go and buy sawdust, right? People put it down in the winter or, you know, use it for a variety of other things. So, you know, complements in production, they're not as common, but we still do see them, right? So we want to know kind of how those work, okay? So where are we at in time? All right, we're doing pretty good. I won't talk about kind of subsidies. We'll kind of on that, kind of similar to what I did with demand. Don't worry about kind of subsidies on producers. I might ask you a question about taxes because it's very easy, right? So, excuse me. Essentially, if I tax a good, the production of a good, what is that really? It means to now produce the same good, it's going to cost me. So what is a tax? An increase in something we've already talked about. Starts with an I. Input price, right? Increases in taxes on producers are really the same thing as an increase in input prices. If input prices went up, what did we say happened to supply? Decreases. So it has a different name, but just like improvements in technology really was changing the input price, that's all a tax on suppliers will do as well. So for instance, if I'm thinking about putting taxes on goods that are imported, we kind of call that tariffs. What is that going to do to the supply of goods from other countries? Right? Increase the tax, input prices are going up, supply is going to go down, right? Basic economics, right? We can already understand this at week 3. Wonder why some people can't understand it, right? So we've got all these things that shift supply, all these things that shift demand. We can start to think about how, like what does the combination of these two things do when we actually observe markets, right? So when we observe markets, the prices that we actually see, like all of this, like building the supply and demand curve, it's kind of like hypothetically, if the price is $1, $2, $3, $4, et cetera, we want to know what's the price of the good actually going to be. We'll call this our equilibrium, right? So how is the price of a good going to be determined? How many units are we going to see in the market? The easiest kind of way to set this up, it's going to be, this is like the most non-technical way of saying it, it's where the supply and demand curve intersect. Okay? So if we were to draw both the supply and demand curve on the same graph, which I can do for us here, there we go. This would be my what? Supply or demand curve. This would have to then be my demand curve. So I'm telling you that any market I look at, so the market for sweatshirts, the market for Sharpie markers, what's the equilibrium price going to be? So here, instead of like expectations, I'll probably write that out. I'm going to kind of use E to represent, this is the equilibrium price. Or a lot of the times I'll write this as kind of P star. This is our equilibrium, okay? Here would be kind of our equilibrium quantity, right? When we observe things that, like after things have played out, this will be the price and quantity we see for this specific good. Now, why is that the case? What did supply represent? What did demand represent? Marginal benefits, right? We said people do things like individuals as long as what? The marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. You can kind of think about it. If we had more time, I'd give you a slightly different explanation, but this will suffice for now. A market acts like an individual. As long as the people in that market, the marginal benefit of that first unit, if it's higher than the marginal cost to a producer to be able to provide it to the market, they can come to an agreement at some price in between where they're both better off, right? Because if I'm the consumer, my marginal benefit would be above that price. And if I'm the seller, that price is above my marginal cost. Well, that will occur for every single unit up until the marginal benefit is exactly equal to the marginal cost. Now we're both indifferent. It's just like when we talk about individuals making decisions. We do something as long as that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. The market will see a good produced and consumed as long as the marginal benefit to the consumer of that good is greater than the marginal cost. As soon as that's not the case, let's say we were out here at this quantity. Is there any price that we could see this unit sold at? Well, the price was right here. The price to the seller is the what? Marginal benefit. Is that above or below their marginal cost? Below. The seller isn't going to want to sell that. Out here at this quantity, if the price is up here, is that price above or below their marginal benefit? Well, the price to the consumer is the marginal cost. Marginal cost is above that. They're not going to want to consume that. So any point past where supply and demand intersect, we never can come to an agreement at a price. Right? So we'll never see these units supplied or consumed on the market. It stops right where supply is equal to demand, or the exact same concept we talked about literally in week 1, where marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. It's just now, instead of the context of an individual, it's in the context of a market. Markets are made up of individuals. It's not that wild of a stretch, but that happens. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. There we go. So I kind of drew this out for us already. All right, our equilibrium is just going to be the price and quantity where supply is equal to demand. If I have the supply and demand schedules, all that's saying is the equilibrium price is going to be where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. So here, what price would that be? $3. So my equilibrium price is 3. What's the equilibrium quantity? Well, that's where the quantity supplied is equal to my quantity demanded. That's going to be right here, whoops, at a quantity of 15. Okay. questions on that before we keep moving? So I'll save this example. There's some things I want to talk about, but we'll kind of come back to this. But right now, the next thing I want to do is start to analyze kind of shifts in supply and demand and how that impacts now this equilibrium we've talked about. Okay. So let's say, kind of have my steps out here. Let's say we've got a market. We can identify that equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand. Okay. If I have a shift in supply or demand, how is that going to change that equilibrium point? Okay. So let's do here. I've got some blank slides. I said that I would talk about subsidies earlier. So we'll kind of think about what would subsidies to consumers do? And then anything that would shift supply or demand in the same way, we have a nice visual for it, right? So I've got my supply curve. I've got my demand curve. Initially, I can identify where that equilibrium, and we'll call this P1 and Q1, where that equilibrium price and quantity start out at. Sometimes if it helps, right, this is like I said, I'll use stars. So this is kind of our equilibrium point. If I subsidize consumers, so a tax is imposing an additional cost. I said, I'll only ever expect you to know, like putting taxes on the suppliers of goods. That's like an input price. I'll only expect you to know how to use, or I'll only expect you up to this point to know what a subsidy on consumers would do. Because it's easy to think about. If demand reflects what? My marginal. If I give people now money for buying something, so this is like, you know, if you buy an electric vehicle, you get like a tax, you get money back on your taxes, or actually a lot of you get subsidies for consuming education. A lot of you get Pell Grants or these other kind of subsidized amounts of money. So you're given money for buying something. What's going to happen to your demand curve? Is that going to go up or down? Your marginal benefit is now higher. It is whatever it was before, plus you're getting some money from the government. So a subsidy to consumers is going to do what to demand? Increase it or shift it to the right. I'm just using 1 and 2 to kind of think about old and, you know, where was demand at before, where is it now? So if I have an increase in demand, right? So here this kind of represented an increase in demand. What's happening to my equilibrium price and quantity? So demand increases, did what to my price? Increased it. What did it do to my equilibrium quantity? Increased it, right? So any of these things that we talked about that shift demand, if they increase demand, they're going to increase both the equilibrium price and quantity, okay? Now, if I had something, let's say, oh, I don't know, I have a normal good and all of a sudden the economy tanks, income goes way down. What's that going to do to my demand curve? For normal goods, if people have less money, they're going to demand, saw someone pointing down, a lot less of them. Let's say the economy really tanks, right? I thought this was going to be here. Is this easier to, maybe not, but here's my new demand curve, right? So huge decrease in demand. What did this decrease in demand do? My new equilibrium, kind of using 3 to identify it. What's happened to my equilibrium price? It's went down. What's happened to my equilibrium quantity? So demand shifts are kind of easy. I shouldn't say they're easy, but whichever direction demand shifts, if it increases or decreases, it also increases both the price and quantity or decreases both the price and quantity. Okay? Any questions on that idea? So we identify this equilibrium, and then when we have demand shifts, where will that new equilibrium be? So here I said, first of all, I'm never going to give you examples where I give subsidies to producers. I said, we're only going to look at taxes on producers, but I'm telling you it's a subsidy on consumers. Anytime you see the word consumer, you should automatically be thinking about demand. Yep. It's a good question. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. What if instead I had a market and it's currently in equilibrium? And just to kind of give an example, since we glossed over it a little bit, let's say I have taxes on the producers. So we said taxes are essentially an increase in what? Input prices. So if it costs me more to make something, what's going to happen to my supply curve? Is it going to increase or decrease? So what does a decrease in supply look like? We said decreases in any curve are leftward shifts, right? So if I had a supply decrease, what happens? Where's my new equilibrium point? Where does that new supply curve hit the demand curve? Well, here it looks like it's at a higher price, but what's happened to the equilibrium quantity? It actually drives the equilibrium quantity down. So it's not as easy as demand. When demand decreases, both the price and quantity, equilibrium price and quantity fall. When supply decreases, the quantity will fall, but the price is actually going to go up. And if it kind of helps you to remember this, why? If I have fewer suppliers, I think I mentioned this last class, if not, what am I getting closer to? A game that we all played as kids. There's fewer suppliers. Eventually, there's only going to be one supplier. We would call that a monopoly, right? That firm has a lot of control over the price. Sure enough, leads to higher prices. Okay? So that's kind of the intuition there. Let's say I had the price of a complementary good go up. So let's say, I don't know, I'm producing, I don't know, something in a chemical, something in a lab, and I'm getting some byproduct that can be sold all of a sudden for a bunch of money because they found some new technology that it can now be used to, I don't know, as fertilizer or something like that, right? Actually, we'll use a good one. Let's say I've got like a farm and I'm selling goats, and all of a sudden the price of fertilizer goes way up, right? What's going to happen to my supply of goats? Well, having more goats, I'm going to end up with more fertilizer, right? So if fertilizer prices go up or the price of a complementary good goes up, I'm going to want to supply more of the complement, the other goods. So there I would have a supply what? Increase. What's that going to do to my equilibrium price and quantity? Supply increases or rightward shifts, right, in supply will push the price down, but push my equilibrium quantity up. So supply shifts, I would argue, are a little bit more difficult than demand shifts. Okay. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So I've got like a summary where they're not all on the same graph, if that helps. I don't know. I think it helps to see kind of it built out. So you're going to have those in the slides as well to kind of reference. The next thing that we'll kind of work through, I'll work through an example, and I'm not going to be able to do every combination in class, just given time. But let's say we have shifts in multiple things. So I just analyzed what the effects of demand shifts and supply shifts would look like. But in the real world, things are always changing. Sometimes things are changing at the same time that impact supply and demand. Okay. So let's say I have this example. I chose asphalt here, and there's a huge increase in the price of oil. So if you don't know this, in order to produce asphalt, you actually, one of the inputs is oil, right? So if the price of oil goes up, what's that going to do to supply? If it's an input and the input price goes up, supply is going to go down or decrease, right? So we've got a supply decrease. If we have a substitute in here, I was thinking about consumption. I should have been a little bit more specific, but I'm thinking about people like putting down driveways. If I can consume, I can, build either an asphalt driveway or I can buy a gravel driveway. If the price of asphalt goes up, what am I more likely to put in my house? A gravel driveway. So what's going to happen to the demand? Or sorry. Oh, I did this backwards. Let's say gravel driveways become more expensive, right? Increase in gravel goes way up. What's going to then happen to the demand for asphalt driveways? It's going to go up, right? It's more costly to put in a gravel driveway. I'm going to substitute away, right, towards building an asphalt driveway. So I've got these two things that caused a shift in supply and demand, right? And once again, if I was like on the quiz here, I'll make sure I'm very careful. I actually went through this yesterday for this very reason, to make sure that like I have these multiple, I either say it's in consumption or production. So, is this demand or supply? So we've got a supply decrease, demand increase. What's that going to do to our equilibrium point? So this is where if it were me, I would save myself a little bit more room, but I would draw them out separately, right? So you can always start out drawing your upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. You can then identify your initial equilibrium prices. Well, I shouldn't say prices. I'm drawing it on two graphs. So my price and quantity, okay? So the first thing that we had, and I'm already forgetting what is it, it was a supply decrease, right? Yeah. So a supply decrease would be a leftward shift, right? So what is that supply decrease going to do to my equilibrium? It's going to cause, so I would say, okay, here's my supply decrease. It caused my price to go up, but it caused my quantity to go down, right? At the same time, we said gravel was becoming more expensive, which was a substitute in consumption. So that led to an increase kind of in our demand curve. So what did that do to our equilibrium point? That demand increase caused both our price and our quantity to go up. Okay. Now, it didn't save myself a lot of room. Generally, I would have written this right here. Well, I think I've got just enough room. You can kind of see what I'm getting at here. Here's my columns, I guess. So this was like each individual effect. What would be my total effect if these happened at the same time? Well, for sure, what's going to happen to price when these both happen at the same time? Price has to go up. Right? What's going to happen to my equilibrium quantity? Well, it only stays the same if the shifts are exactly equal. If I don't have any additional information, this is the first time of many in this class where sometimes the changes will be what we call indeterminate. I won't push you this far, but you would need to know something about the size of the changes, right? If the decrease in supply was more than the increase in demand, well, then this would be the one that kind of wins out, right? The problem is I'm not going to give you, we're not dealing with the actual values. We don't know how large these shifts are. Anytime you have two shifts that push either price or quantity in different directions, we would say the change in that thing is indeterminate. I'll use question marks instead of writing out that whole word, but indeterminate there. And the reason why is like, depending on how large you draw these shifts, your equilibrium point could end up different places. So I think I've got another visual of it in the slides here that can kind of make sense of it maybe. And there's different combinations, right? Oh, here we go. So we just did what? A supply decrease and a demand increase. So we were looking at this one, right? Notice if the demand increases a bunch, right, we could end up with a quantity that's higher, or if the supply decreases a bunch, we could end up with a quantity that's lower. But no matter what shifts we have, our kind of new equilibrium with our new supply and our new demand curves, the price is always higher, right? So, depending on what types of, combination of shifts you have, you really have 4 different possibilities, right? So here's kind of those 4 different, 4 possibilities. We're not going to work through every single one for the sake of time, but you would set them up the exact same way. And I would use the shorthand where I draw the arrows. I just think it helps make a lot of sense, right? Where are we at here? I think that gives me everything. So we got 15 minutes. Did I not have another example in here? Did I skip through it? Oh, here it is. This was just kind of, instead of doing it by shorthand, if you wanted to write out the words, you could. Once again, I would just use the arrows. I think that's the easiest way to kind of keep things nice and concise and really see, okay, if both the arrows are moving in the same direction, I know that thing is going to increase. If both of them are moving in opposite directions, I know the total effect is going to be indeterminate, right? I don't know. And just because the example we did, we had price go up, but quantity was indeterminate. You can have different examples where quantity goes up or down, and then the price is indeterminate. Okay? So this is where working through the practice problems, just working through more problems is going to be helpful. Like you could even set this up, try to draw out each individual one on your own and see if you can reproduce kind of what these outcomes are going to be from these different combinations of supply and demand increases or decreases. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to do something. Let me see. Right now. Do I have it down here? There we go. So I think the one I put up should have this slide. If not, it's further up as well. Now I already forgot where it's at. Oh, we had it earlier. There it is. Slide what? 40. I think I actually duplicated it and put it down here as well. We're going to work through the first 5 of these. There's one thing specifically I want to show you how to do. But as I'm kind of working through this, I'm probably going to be nice today, and we'll kind of do it really quick at the end. So I'd pull up Canvas. I'll kind of get that quiz deployed right now, and then we'll kind of talk through it here at the end. So there we go. Let's refresh to make sure it's showing up there. Anyone, you're not seeing it in the next couple minutes, please stop me, but I'm going to start this other example just for the sake of time. Okay. So we'll get to that quiz in a second. Just for the sake of getting the, the Wi-Fi kind of sucks in here, just to get it going. Okay. So I said that the equilibrium point is where supply is equal to demand, right? What's behind each one of those curves? An actual equation, right? So if I have my supply and demand equation, like I do here, I could ask a couple questions. So the first is, what's the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of my 5th and 3rd unit? If I wanted the marginal benefit of the 5th unit here, what would I do? Which of these curves would represent the marginal benefit? Yeah, I heard someone say it, my demand curve, right? Which of these would represent my marginal costs? Supply. So if I want the marginal benefit of I think it was the 5th unit, well, here's my demand equation. That price essentially tells me the marginal benefit of these different units. All I do is plug that quantity I'm interested in finding the marginal benefit of into my demand curve, and that price would reflect that quantity's marginal benefit. So here, this would be what? The marginal benefit would be 75, if I'm doing math in my head correct. What if I wanted the marginal cost? Sorry, I put 150 here. It's times Q. I was writing quick and didn't add my little thing there. So if I wanted the marginal cost of the 3rd unit, well, my supply curve, that price reflects to me that marginal cost. This is multiplied by, right? So how would I find my marginal cost of the 3rd unit? Just plugging a 3 in here, I get what? 65, if I'm doing math in my head correct. So we can find the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of these different units by simply plugging them into my supply and demand curve. Now I can also do that by like visually finding the point where I'm at on my supply and demand curve, like visually, but I can do it with equations as well. Okay. Now another thing I can do, so first of all, any questions? That shouldn't be too terrible. So this is about the extent to which I'll push you with algebra this class. I'm going to do a little bit more later on, but for right now, this is about as far as we'll go. If I'm visually identifying my equilibrium, where that supply curve is equal to my demand curve, if I have two equations, I know that this is going to be the price where the quantity supplied is exactly the same as the quantity demanded. Now, I didn't write it up here, but technically, my demand equation is quantity demanded, and my supply equation is the quantity supplied. But I know that in equilibrium, those two things are the same exact thing, right? It's the exact same quantity. So how can I solve for what that equilibrium quantity is? Well, if this is my supply equation, this is my demand equation, I'm just going to set them equal to each other, right? So I'll take my demand equation, set that equal to my supply equation, and now it's just a little bit of algebra, right? So I what? Subtract 20 from both sides, add 5q to both sides. I get what? 80 is equal to 20q. Divide both sides by 20, and I get that the equilibrium quantity is what? 4, right? So all I do to solve for my equilibrium quantity is set that supply and demand equation equal to each other and solve for the thing I don't know. Solve for that quantity. Now, once I have that quantity, how can I figure out what the equilibrium price is? Well, it's going to be the price where I'm on my supply curve or on my demand curve. So there's actually two ways we could do it. I could take this and to solve for my equilibrium price, I could plug it into my demand curve. I could also take that equilibrium quantity and define my equilibrium price, plug it into my supply curve. Either one, if I've solved it correctly, should give me the exact same value, right? That's where those two lines are intersecting. I'm gonna drop my cap there, all right? So if I go ahead and do that, right, what? 100 minus 5 times 4 would be what? 80? If I plug 4 into here, 20 plus 15 times 4 would also be 80. Sure enough, I find the exact same equilibrium quantity, whether or not I plug that I find the same equilibrium price, whether or not I take that same equilibrium quantity and plug it into either my supply and demand curve. So it's another good way to check yourself. You'll first always, so if I'm writing these steps out, you'll set supply equal to demand. You'll solve for your equilibrium quantity. Your third step is then plug that equilibrium quantity into either supply or demand. If it were me, I would make this a two-step process and I would do both, right? I would plug it into demand and supply just to make sure I'm getting the same answer. Because if I get a different answer here, I know I made a mistake somewhere, right? I didn't actually find the correct equilibrium quantity, because if I found the correct equilibrium quantity, when I plug it into my supply and demand curves, it should give me the exact same value. Okay. Any questions there? So we were kind of doing all the visual stuff with equilibriums. I won't ever make you do the math behind shifts, right? So anytime we do shifts, it's just a matter of identifying does the price go up or down. But on the quiz and on the exam, I might be very likely, in fact, I will give you a supply and demand equation where you have to solve for the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So that should, I said on shortages and surpluses, I'll kind of push that off in the next week. So there shouldn't be any questions on this quiz about shortages and surpluses, but there could be on the exam. We'll cover it early next week. Module 4, there's a little bit less material than Module 3, so we should have more than enough time next week. Before we get out of here, though, if we look at that quiz, we've got 5 minutes, right? That might be kind of helpful. So this is where these quizzes are really meant to be like easy if you're here, right? So let's take a preview. Or you should be starting them. I think I have it set to be due here in 5 minutes, but we can go through it pretty quick. So let's say I tax the production of vehicles. This should be a very easy one. We talked about that. We said taxes are essentially what? Input prices, increases in input prices. So if my input prices go up, am I going to want to supply, I'm the producer, the production of the good, will supply increase or decrease? Supply decreases are left or rightward shifts, leftward shifts. Right? What if I've got electric vehicles and all of a sudden a substitute in production? So I'm Chevy or I'm Ford. I'm producing these products. If electric vehicles all of a sudden, if the price of gas vehicles all of a sudden decreases, what's going to happen to my supply of electric vehicles? Well, the gas-powered vehicles decrease in price. Am I more or less likely to want to use my production facility to produce those? Less likely. So instead of producing gas-powered vehicles, what am I going to use my production facility to produce? The other kind of substitute in production, gasoline. So I would see a supply. So gas-powered vehicles, the price goes down. I don't want to produce those. I'm going to start producing electric vehicles. My supply of electric vehicles will increase, which is going to be a what? Rightward shift, or like this, right? This is the other one, which I said, we worked through an example, but I just wanted to make sure I kind of reiterated. Actually, I would give you maybe a tax on producers, and I could ask you a question where I talk about subsidies, but only to consumers. We won't think about it with producers, it gets a little confusing. Subsidies to consumers, this is just when the government gives you money for doing something. All right, so this usually it's through tax write-offs. Like I said, a lot of you, it's Pell Grants, like receiving money for education. So if I'm subsidizing electric vehicles, this is something that the government does because clean energy, yay, right? So we give people money for buying these electric vehicles because it's better for society. So if I'm given more money, am I more or less likely to want to buy an electric vehicle? More likely. So what's going to happen to the demand when I give consumers subsidies? It increases or shifts to the rightward shifts. Okay. So make sure you get those submitted here in the next couple minutes. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is cooperating. If for some reason you don't get it in here in the next minute or two, stop by and try to. Other than that, that quiz will pop up after my next section. You'll have that in the module reading. A fun, safe weekend. I will see you guys on Tuesday.